Ever since we exchanged vows, my husband, a self-proclaimed mama's boy, had completely avoided any household responsibilities. His dependence on me became even more apparent when I mentioned an upcoming business trip. Panicked, he asked, "Who's going to take care of me while you're gone?" His reaction triggered a heated argument, and I went on my week-long journey, fuming. When I returned, I found a note beside the divorce papers. It read, "Since you neglected the housework, I'm going back to my parents. Think about these papers while I'm gone." His audacity to threaten divorce made my blood boil, but as I reflected, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the right path. Maybe a divorce wasn't such a bad idea after all. With newfound resolve, I filed the papers the next day. The following morning, my stunned husband stormed in, demanding, "Where are the divorce papers?" When I told him they had already been submitted, he collapsed into tears, utterly baffled and inconsolable. "My name is Grace. I'm 32 and have been married to Edward for just over a year. After college, I climbed the corporate ladder with determination. At 32, without a partner and under pressure from my parents to settle down, I reluctantly joined a dating agency. That's where I met Edward, a soft-spoken man a few years younger than me who worked at a mixed firm. Our connection was immediate, and he was respectful and understanding throughout our courtship. I believed he was the one. When he proposed, I was overjoyed, convinced we'd spend our lives together, but marriage brought challenges I hadn't anticipated. When I accepted his proposal, we became engaged, and the first stop was visiting my parents. They stressed the importance of a lifelong commitment. "Grace, always be there for Edward," they advised. I agreed, with Edward listening attentively. Next, we visited his parents. His father, Arthur, greeted me warmly. "I've heard so much about you from my boy. It's wonderful to finally meet you." But his mother, Michelle, was less enthusiastic. With a sharp look, she asked, "Edward, is this the one?" To which Edward responded confidently, "Yep, Mommy, I want to marry her." I was slightly taken aback by his use of "mommy" and Michelle's directness. Arthur quickly intervened, apologizing for her bluntness. He reassured me, "We're happy about the marriage, but just so you know, Edward's had it easy here. He might be a bit of a challenge." I replied, "I love Edward's gentle side, and I know we'll support each other." Arthur then turned to Edward, urging him, "Starting a family is a big deal. Step up and make sure she's happy." Edward nodded earnestly. Our visit ended, and soon after, Edward and I celebrated our union with a small wedding. My parents generously gifted us a condo, and we began our married life. However, it quickly became clear that Edward wasn't accustomed to household chores. One morning, while I was juggling laundry and breakfast, his alarm went off at 8 o'clock, but he stayed asleep. No matter how much I tried to wake him, he didn't stir. After finally pulling off his covers and shaking him, he opened his eyes slowly. "Wow, it's 8:10 already, why didn't you wake me up?" he complained. I sighed, "I did try, and your alarm was blaring too. Now, please eat your breakfast." He dragged himself to the table, and within seconds, started complaining about the eggs. "Hey, Grace, these eggs are too runny. I can't eat them unless they're well done. Make them again." I was hanging laundry and trying to stay calm, but I snapped, "Then don't eat them." "Why would you say that? And this coffee, it's too hot. Mommy always made the eggs and coffee just right." "Fine," I sighed, redoing the eggs and letting the coffee cool. He rushed through his breakfast, leaving the plate on the table as he dashed to the restroom. "Wait, you know you're supposed to clean up after yourself." "I'm in a hurry," he called back, dismissing his responsibility, even though he was late because of his own delay. Frustrated, I cleaned up the dishes while getting ready for work. Then he called out, "Grace, help with my tie." There he stood, looking helpless with the tie hanging around his neck. "Seriously, you can't even tie your own tie? What did you do before we got married?" "Mommy always did it," he admitted sheepishly. With a deep sigh, I tied his tie, and somehow we both managed to leave the house. This became our daily routine. He never helped with anything, and it felt like I was juggling the household and babysitting him. Every problem was met with, "Mommy did it this way," or "with Mommy, it was like this." Over the course of the year, the frustration built up, and thoughts of divorce began to creep in. My father's constant reminder that marriage is a lifelong commitment echoed in my mind, tempering my frustrations. However, an unexpected hiccup at work led to a week-long business trip being scheduled for the very next day. When I shared the news with my husband that evening, he paused his video game, clearly surprised. "A whole week?" he asked, eyes wide. "You're leaving for a week?" "It's out of my hands," I explained. "Work's calling." Who's going to handle everything here while you're gone? His voice was tinged with irritation. You'll have to step up, I said firmly. It's about time you take on some household duties. He set down his controller and locked eyes with me. Isn't it the wife's job to take care of her husband and the house? Are you just going to bail on that? His words were steeped in outdated, traditional expectations. That's an old school view. We both work. We should be partners, I shot back. That's not how I see it. Mommy always handled everything at home, he replied defensively. She was a stay-at-home mom, and, honestly, it's odd hearing an adult man constantly talk about mommy, I pointed out. He bristled. What's your deal, taking shots at me and my mommy? I'm not taking shots, but let's face it, you're a mama's boy, I said. This is how you see me? You think you can talk to me like that? His voice rose, the defensiveness escalating. I've had enough, I said, standing my ground. You can't get up without help, can't tie your own tie, and won't do anything around the house. You constantly compare me to your mother. For once, take responsibility. Really? That's why I was unsure about marrying someone older. Should have just stayed with mommy or picked a younger, perky girl, he snapped, his words hitting deep. The conversation took a sharp turn, his comment stung, and it spiraled into a full-blown argument. You shouldn't even joke like that. We're married, I said, trying to ground us in the commitment we had made to each other. The tension between us was undeniable, revealing the rifts that had long existed. Then, in a moment of frustration, he threatened divorce. You really want a divorce? He sneered. You wouldn't want to be labeled divorced, would you? And think about what your dad always says about sticking together. His tone shifted, becoming sharper. Well, I just did. If you go on this trip and leave me here alone, I'm seriously considering it. Those words hit hard. He stormed off to the bedroom, leaving me stunned. The idea of divorce, once unthinkable to me, now felt real, a possibility I had to confront. I went to bed that night with a heavy heart. The fallout from our argument lingered, but I had commitments to honor. The next morning, I prepared for my trip. Feeling the weight of our tension, I nudged Edward, still under the covers. I'm leaving. You better wake up or you'll be late for work. He mumbled something unintelligible, rolling my eyes. I left without another word. A few hours later, a text popped up on my phone from him. You barely woke me up. Now I'm running late. Did you really go on that trip? I texted back quickly. I did wake you up. And yes, I'm on my trip. I'll be back in a week. He read my message but didn't respond. Mid-trip, I felt the need to confide in my parents about Edward's behavior and my growing doubts about the marriage. I wasn't sure how they'd react, but I needed their advice. The conversation was difficult, but necessary. Their response was a surprising relief. We didn't know he was like this, my dad said. Take your time, don't stay in a situation that isn't right for you. We're here for you, no matter what you decide. Their unconditional support brought tears to my eyes. When I returned from the trip, I knew I needed to have a serious conversation with Edward. If nothing changed, I was ready to consider divorce. Walking into the house that evening, my mind was racing, only to find that Edward wasn't home yet. On the table, I spotted a note and a set of signed divorce papers. The note read, "Since you ditched the housework, I'm heading back to my folks. Look over the divorce papers and think things through." My initial reaction was pure rage. How dare he threaten me with divorce? But as I took a breath and let my anger subside, I began to view the situation differently. Perhaps this was a sign that ending things might be the right choice. I decided, with a calm resolve, to file the papers. When the divorce was finalized, it felt like a heavy weight was lifted. That evening, I went to bed feeling a peace I hadn't known in months. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee in quiet reflection, the door swung open, and in walked Edward, looking upset. "Why didn't you come to my parents' place to apologize?" he demanded. "What's gotten into you?" Edward demanded, his temper flaring as he stormed into the room. But when he noticed the empty space where the divorce papers had been, his anger quickly shifted to shock. "Hold on, where are the divorce papers?" he asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. "I filed them," I replied calmly, without a hint of hesitation. "You did what?" His eyes widened as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You actually went through with it? Thanks for signing them. It made everything a lot easier," I said, my voice steady. "You can't be serious. Did you actually go through with it? Have you lost your mind?" he exclaimed, still processing the depth of my decision. Seeing how composed I remained only seemed to make him more unhinged. "That's it. I'm calling my parents," he shouted. "Sure, Go ahead, I said, undisturbed, knowing that I had made the right decision for myself. About an hour later, Michelle and Arthur arrived at our apartment, their presence filling the room with tension. Michelle's eyes immediately locked onto me, and she burst out dramatically, how could you just divorce Edward like that? What is wrong with you? I took a deep breath and responded coolly, if he had the divorce papers filled out and ready to go, doesn't that suggest he wanted out? Is that a problem? How dare you be so bold? You're just his wife, Michelle shot back, her voice rising in indignation. Before things could escalate further, Arthur intervened with a firm tone. Enough. The room fell silent, his presence commanding attention. He turned to me and said, Grace, can you walk us through what happened? I nodded and began to explain the ongoing issues, our argument before my trip, and the divorce papers Edward had left for me. I was at my wit's end. It seemed like he wanted a divorce, so I went with it, I said, meeting Arthur's gaze. Arthur paused, considering my words carefully. Just as he was about to speak, Edward interrupted with a shrill cry, Mom, Dad, can't you see she's out of line? Tell her off. Michelle quickly sided with him, her voice dripping with concern. Oh, Edward, my poor baby, she's so hasty, you need to reverse the divorce right now. There's no reversing it, the divorce is final, we're strangers now, I stated firmly, not backing down. Michelle's face turned an angry red as she opened her mouth to retaliate, but once again, Arthur cut her off. Zip it, Michelle, he said, his voice firm. He then turned to me, his tone softer. I'm sorry for what you've had to go through because of Edward's behavior. Arthur turned to Edward, whose eyes were wide with shock, and continued, You've really outdone yourself, haven't you? Using divorce papers as a threat? Unbelievable, you had it coming. Michelle opened her mouth to protest, but Arthur didn't let up. It's partly on you, Michelle, you spoiled him, watch out. If you keep this up, I might divorce you too. The room was thick with tension as Arthur's words sank in. Edward and Michelle were left speechless, unable to respond. Michelle was visibly shaken, her mind likely racing over the threat of divorce from Arthur. She muttered to herself, her face pale. Arthur turned back to me, his expression softening with genuine regret. Grace, I deeply regret what our clueless son has put you through. It's clear he has a lot to learn. Please, move on and find happiness. You deserve it. I nodded, grateful for his understanding. Thank you, Arthur, I appreciate that, I said. With that, Arthur and a dejected Edward left the apartment. The silence that followed felt like a heavy release. It wasn't long before the news spread throughout our circle. Arthur had decided to cut financial and emotional ties with his son, hoping it would push Edward toward independence. The consequences were immediate. Edward moved into a modest, neglected apartment, his first time truly living on his own. The transition wasn't smooth, and soon enough, his life began to unravel. His apartment became a chaotic mess, a visual representation of the disorganization and dysfunction in his personal life. His habitual tardiness and inability to follow through with commitments caught up with him, and soon he found himself unemployed. Meanwhile, the situation within his family deteriorated further. Michelle, who had been deeply involved in every aspect of Edward's life, overstepped one boundary too many, leading to a massive fallout with Arthur. This culminated in their separation. Michelle moved in with Edward, and together, they tried to make ends meet, but it was a struggle. Both found themselves in low-paying jobs, barely scraping by, with no clear path forward. On the other hand, my life took a very different trajectory. Freed from the emotional strain of my relationship with Edward, I settled into our condo, which felt like a sanctuary. The space was now mine, and I could finally breathe without the constant tension. With renewed energy and focus, I dedicated myself to my career. The absence of Edward's negativity allowed me to excel at work, and my professional life flourished. Feeling liberated and optimistic, I embraced my newfound independence. The condo, once shared with Edward, had transformed into my own personal refuge, a place where I could relax and plan for my future. The change in my work life was palpable, and I approached each new day with excitement and anticipation. As I reflected on the stark contrast between my thriving existence and the downward spiral of Edward and Michelle's lives, I realized just how far I had come. The lessons learned from our time together resonated deeply within me, solidifying my commitment to personal growth, happiness, and independence.